Alright guys, so welcome to the third video for Chapter 15. In this video we're going to look at polygenic inheritance. That is, what happens when you have more than one gene affecting a particular type of trait. Okay, so let's jump into it. Alright, polygenic inheritance. Yeah, so up until now all of the examples we've looked at, cystic fibrosis, flower color, and blood type are all determined by one particular gene. Yeah. Now all of those traits are called monogenic traits. Mono meaning single, genic meaning one. So the monogenic trait is a trait that is controlled by the expression of one gene, and so the alleles of that gene play a really big role, and you can actually identify how they interact with one another through that. Traits can be influenced by multiple genes that act together. So the same trait could have multiple components that are all contributing in some way or another into that particular trait. And the more genes you have, generally the more complex that particular trait actually is. But we call those particular traits a polygenic traits. Yeah, traits that are controlled by multiple genes. Poly meaning multiple, genic referring to genes and the trait. Okay, so an example, eye color. Even though it looks like, oh, you know, just brown and blue and things, is actually a polygenic trait because it is determined by a variety of different genes. And human height is a trait that is also affected by heaps and heaps of different genes as well. Okay, so let's jump and take a look at that. Okay, depending on sort of what kind of trait it is, you can either have what we call a discrete variation or discontinuous variation within the trait, which is when you have these few clear and distinct categories, and they don't typically overlap. Yeah, so your monogenic traits are generally discrete. Yeah, flower color, it's either white or purple or pink if it was like a blend of kind of the both in snapdragons and things like that. Blood type will be A, B, AB, and O, right? And so they come in these kind of very discrete patterns, yeah, and they don't overlap. In polygenic traits, you typically have not categories, but this kind of continuous spectrum, and the more complex it is, the more the spectrum kind of pans out in these kind of more continuous variation, right? And so human height doesn't have discrete non-overlapping patterns, but actually all of them sort of contribute to these changes, which then determines the overall height of the individual. Okay, and so that's called a continuous variation, right? And it's not the only one. Typically, the more genes are involved, the more variations you'll see in the trait, right? And we're going to look at how that sort of determines that. Okay, so here's human height. This graph shows the frequency of height in human populations around the world, right? Along the x-axis, you have the actual height distribution, and on the y shows you how frequent that is in our population. Yeah, so basically the higher the number, the more people there are of that particular height. So you can see there the average heights sort of match around there. You can see for men there is the kind of distribution of height. Most men will sit round about here, from about just maybe shy of 180, around there. You've got a few extreme examples of men being, you know, really short, down towards 150, 140, and then you've also got a few examples of men being really tall, from about 180 plus all the way to about 7 foot, right? For women, you can see the pattern is a bit more condensed, right? So most women will fit round about the 160 to 165 mark, right? And then the majority of the population will sit there, and some of them going down to 140 and some of them going up to about 190 plus. Yeah. Now obviously there are extreme cases where, you know, women that are really tall and men fall outside of this particular range, but this is a kind of a bell curve, a normal curve of the population, right? And so you can see there the bulk of the population will sit around here. So the difference between women and men, well, on average women are shorter, more women are around this particular height range than men, and two, there's less variation in women than there are in men. So, you know, they're more condensed together, the pattern is more condensed together, right? Human height is not determined by one gene. If you really think about what makes a person tall, you've got things like the length of the spine, the length of the thigh, the femur, and then the legs, and then the neck, and all of these things, muscle tone, you know, bone length, and things like that. They all make some sort of small contribution to the height. Yeah, so one gene might create, you know, slight variations or length in the femur, and another gene might create variations in the vertebrae or the spine. Another one, and again, might make bigger heads, for example, right? And each of these genes contribute to the overall height. And so you can't narrow down height to one or two traits, but a variety of different traits, right? And so rather than trying to make sense of all of it, we kind of look at the trait overall, and we look at how the alleles of those genes either contribute to the height, in which case we just put a little plus allele, or makes no contribution to the height, which we call a negative or a minus allele, right? And so the greater number of plus alleles, generally the greater the height. And so you can then determine based on these categories sort of how the genes have some sort of effect. We don't look at dominance and recessive characteristics because it's not confined to one gene. If it was only one gene, you would then look at the alleles of that gene and determine which one's dominant and which one's recessive. But because human height has so many different factors, it's too complicated to determine all of those factors of all of those genes. Okay. Now, eye color is probably not as complex as human height, but it's still fairly complicated, right? So your iris are determined by two particular factors. Melanin pigments developed in the melanocytes of the iris, right? Melanin is a pigmentation protein, right? The more you have, the darker the eye color, right? And these cells within the iris produce that amount of pigments. So one, basically, how many pigments is in each cell, and then also how many cells is in each eye. And so those are the two main factors that are determined. Now, there are about 16 genes that will determine those numbers, that determine how much pigmentation you have, or how concentrated the pigmentation is, and then also how many cells you actually have in the eye. All right? There are a few that are mainly associated, OCA2 and HERC2 genes. OCA2 is the main one, right? It produces the melanin which causes brown pigmentation. It's also the same gene that causes pigmentation of your skin. So higher levels of pigmentation of melanin resulting in brown or darker colored eyes, okay? HCR2 is not a coding gene. It doesn't code for a protein. However, it switches the OCA2 on and off. And so the presence of HERC2 and its variations will determine the switching on and off of OCA2, which then determines whether you have brown eyes or non-brown eyes, right? As you can see there, we're getting into very complex territory here because it's not a simple of does this contribute, does it not contribute. This one switches on, this one switches off, and contributes to those things. There's a few others as well, which you can sort of have a look there on this table, which I've just basically ripped off your book. There are specific mutations, strongly linked to blue eyes and brown eyes and things like that. Okay, usually what we sort of have is this kind of like this little table that determines kind of percentages and the possibilities of eye colors. Right, you can sort of see there. Generally, brown and brown will result mainly in brown eyes. A small percentage of blue and sometimes a bit of green. Right, and you can see that there's all the variations you can likelihood of getting. Now, none of it is absolute. You cannot make an absolute determination on this because it really all depends on the complexity of the genes that are contributing to that. Okay, but you can sort of see there of the different possible variations. So it is entirely possible for two parents who have brown eyes to have a child with blue eyes and with green eyes, etc. Okay. However, you can see there having blue eyes, two parents with blue eyes, you're not going to get brown eyes, or you're very unlikely to get brown eyes because blue eyes some of those genes have a recessive allele or exhibit a recessive trait. Okay. Increasing the number of genes involved will result in a greater variation. And skin pigmentation, here's an example. So if we say that there are two genes involved, right? Here is gene 1 and here is gene 2, and let's say they both contribute to skin pigmentation, okay? What do these pluses and minuses mean? Well, what that means is that we're going to look at the number of possibilities and the number of different traits that you have, right? If you have two genes, right, and each of those genes will have two alleles, right, which means you've got 4 different alleles that are possible for the two genes. Right. Now, if they are all contributing to pigmentation, plus, which means they're all adding melanin to the skin color, you would get a very dark individual, right? And that's one phenotype, very dark, right? If you look at those variations, the two genes, right, you might have a plus plus, and then the other one is a plus minus. That slight minus results in less contribution, and you would just have dark, right? You can flip it around, but they pretty much mean the same thing, right? And that would result in dark. If you have plus plus and minus minus, so half half, you would have an intermediate dark. If you have a majority minus, it'll be slightly dark, and if you have all negatives, it'll be light skin color. So you can see there, only 2 genes, but by having 2 genes, you now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different variations in the individual, depending on the alleles and their particular traits, yeah? So you can imagine there, the complexity increases every time you add an extra gene that contributes to that trait. You increase all the possibilities of it. And the general rule is that as you add genes that contribute to that particular trait, you end up with a more continuous variation within the trait, okay? How do you determine the number? Well, the number of variations you can possibly get, the phenotype will be 2n plus 1, always, yeah? Where n being the number of genes being involved. If it's 2 genes, 2 times 2 plus 1 is 5 variations, and you can sort of see there, if you have 3 genes, it'll be 2 times 3 plus 1, which will be 7 variations. 4 genes, 2 times 4 plus 1, which is 9 variations, right? So once you get to things like human height, with the number of variations you have, you can imagine there's, hundreds, if not thousands of genes that are contributing to the overall height of an individual, or contributing in one way or another. So that's how you play the numbers game with the plus and the minuses, okay? You now also have to think the complexity increases even more if you think about the environment, because the phenotype, the variations themselves are also determined by the environment. An individual who plays basketball, for example, and things like that, might be adding to the complexity of human height. Diet, individuals who have a healthy diet are more likely to supply their body with nutrients, allowing a greater growth in the body, and things like exposure to sunlight, resulting in changes in vitamins, etc., etc. So, based on that, you should be able to sort of understand that polygenic inheritance is incredibly complex, and it's very difficult to sort of study in depth and isolate particular genes that are involved, okay? So some traits are simply too difficult to identify the genes that are involved, because basically almost every gene will determine that thing, so that's just worth noting. Okay, all right, so that's it for chapter 15. Hope you guys enjoyed and learned something there, and I'll catch you guys in the next chapter.